Okay, so we're ready to go. Today is going to be a very interesting class. I'm going to share my screen, and it's a story that I didn't know anything about until I came across that, and I found it extremely fascinating. We are going to talk about She'era bat Ephraim. Okay, She'era bat Ephraim. We'll get there. It's a kind of, you have to bear with me a couple of minutes and until we get to her and what was going on and how I got into that. Today is the English date is December 1st. And December 1st is the English Yortzeit of David Ben-Gurion, Israel's first prime minister. And of course, we can spend a whole semester, a whole year, a whole lifetime learning about his contribution to Am Yisrael and the state of Israel. But I want to highlight one of his passions that is not that known. Ben-Gurion, even though he was born into a religious family, a very traditional family, and in the beginning he went to a cheder, etc. Like many of his generation, actually, he rejected that lifestyle, traditional lifestyle, and became a huge Zionist, obviously, and in that sense, that Zionism became the new religion, so to say, for many of that generation. And Ben-Gurion loved the Bible extremely, and he saw it not only as a religious book, but a book that has historic importance and crucial for our life in Eretz Israel, our life as a Jewish nation in the modern state of Israel. So he was tremendously impacted by the Bible, and he quoted very often from the Bible. He had this ability to find a connection between the Bible and the modern state of Israel and the future of the Jewish people in Israel. But as we're going to see very soon, sometimes his interpretation of the text were too much controversial and too much to swallow for the religious parties. Already in 1947, Ben-Gurion approached the special committee of the UN that were trying to discuss the right of the Jewish people for independent state in Israel. And in his speech, he compared between the boarding of the Mayflower to America to the Exodus from Egypt. And he was trying to make a point how important it is to have the modern state of Israel for the Jews. And he says the following, if you look here, no one remembers when the Mayflower boarded or what the menu was, unlike the Jewish people who remember exactly the date of the Exodus and the food they ate, right? Matzah, it's Yetziat Mitzrayim, it's the Seder night. We know exactly when it took place and we know exactly what they ate. Later on in the 50s, his interpretation of the Bible and the way he interpreted things and the way he talked about it was very often a source for a lot of controversy. And even though he said that he's based his things on the original texts, okay, Basically he says the following stuff along those lines. In the 50s, he said, based on the original text, the common understanding of the Exodus is wrong. Only one large family went to Egypt, i.e. Jacob, okay? And the Exodus is an undoubtable fact. However, modern Israel and War of Independence enlightened me with new understanding of the Bible. And basically, he started to say that not all the Jews went to Egypt, and there were some Jews that left in Israel, which brings us to 1960. In 1960, he said that the word, when the Torah talks about the word elef, which we translate as 1,000, he said, no, no, no. And he gives proofs for that. So it's interesting. He gives proofs for the word elef is family. So it's only, according to him, it was only 600 families that left Egypt during the Exodus. And it's not 600,000 men, because 600,000 men means close to 3 million people. And he said, that's impossible. You can't drag 3 million people through the Exodus, 40 years in the desert, all that kind of stuff. It's just not realistic. So he said, it's only 600 families that left. Some of the families never left Israel. Fascinating. He said that the whole point is that some and only a small group accepted the Torah. Those who left Egypt accepted the Torah. So that means, what, as a secular Israeli, what is he doing? He's saying, you don't have to accept the Torah in order to be part of the Jewish nation. Because we had some Jews who never left Israel. They stayed, they never went down to Egypt with Jacob. Therefore, they didn't come back from Egypt and receive the Torah in the desert. So, right? So, and more than that, he's saying a couple of interesting things. One, there were always Jews in Israel. The Jews never left Israel, no matter when. And that strengthened our relations with the land. We never left the land. Yeah, some of the family went to Egypt, but not everybody. And then he says the birth of a Jewish nation was not in Egypt. Right? We say that in Egypt, we were born as a nation. He said no, because if we want to establish a Jewish state in Israel, then everything has to be, so to say, pure. It means we never left Israel. The birth of the nation took place in Israel, not in Egypt. And therefore, another point that we understand that he was getting into, that meaning that kibbutz galuyot and gathering of the exiles is doable. We're talking about in the 50s, right? And therefore, at that point, you still have a lot of Jews outside of Israel, especially in the Middle East, in Egypt, in Iraq, in Iran, in right?
Yeah.
And he said, this is doable. We can do it. It's not the first time in history that Jews lived outside of Israel, but they came back. So we can do it. They've done it before. We can do it again. Fascinating. Let's fast forward to 1960, a specific event. Ben-Gurion is giving a speech for a group of journalists. And he says, like, his usual stuff. He doesn't believe that there were 600,000 men leaving Egypt because it's 3 million people. It's not, makes no sense, etc. It's only 600 families, etc. We discussed that. He says the same things. But in May 17th, 1960, the newspaper Haaretz reports that this interpretation of Ben-Gurion created a tremendous controversy, leading to a vote of no confidence in the Israeli government. So you look here in the slide, due to the version of the Exodus that was interpreted or given or by Ben Gurion. The Haredi minister, Harav Yitzchak Meir Levin, from Poalei Agudat Israel, he was the leader of the Aguda party, and he brought to the Knesset a vote of no confidence in the Israeli government because of Ben Gurion's interpretation of the Exodus. He was the minister of welfare at that, the first minister of welfare at the time, and he says the following: "We consider the views expressed by Ben Gurion a harmful attack on our sacred Torah." And of course, Ben Gurion, as a response, says the Knesset cannot decide on historical questions and in questions of belief. Okay, of course, this vote of no confidence did not pass, obviously, and the government stayed in power for another year. But Ben Gurion's point that there was a continuous connection between the Jewish people and Eretz Israel, okay, in gathering kibbutz galuyot is doable, and many non-traditional commentaries on the Bible followed Ben Gurion or had similar opinions. And one of the major stories that they used in order to prove their point that actually there were Jews in Israel all the time and not all the Jews went down to Egypt is our story about She'era. She'era bat Ephraim. She'era, the daughter of Ephraim. Fascinating story. In the book of Chronicles, we find the following story. Uvnei Ephraim, the sons of Ephraim, okay, remember, Ephraim is the son of Joseph, right? As remember, let's go back for a second. We have Jacob, right? One of his sons is obviously Joseph. Joseph ends up in Egypt, and in Egypt he has two sons, Menashe and Ephraim. Now the book of Chronicles go back and gives all the history pretty much from Adam, so this is like as part of that. And he says the following: Uvnei Ephraim, the sons of Ephraim, Shutalach uvered beno, betachat beno, ve'elada beno, betachat beno, all those names, the lineage of Ephraim, ve'zevach beno, ve'shutalach beno, ve'ezer, ve'elad, okay, all those names and all those descendants of Ephraim, not that important. Here I'm coming to the important stuff. Look at the end of the second line. Ve'haragum anshei gat hanoladim ba'aretz ki yardu lakachat et miknehem. Those were killed by the Plishtim in Israel. Those who were in Israel. Those sons of Ephraim who were in Israel, okay, this is the interpretation that most commentaries said, that means Hanoladim Ba'aretz, okay, that could be either the Plishtim, the Philistines were born in Israel, or perhaps these are the sons of Ephraim that were born in Israel, and they were killed by the Plishtim because they had some sort of a fight over the cattle. And then what happens? Vaytabel Ephraim aviem yamim rabim. And Ephraim mourned for many days. Vayavo echav lenachamo. And his brothers came to console him. Vayavo el ishto vatahar vatelet ben. And then Ephraim was with his wife, and she gave birth to a son. Vayikra et shemo Bria. Miriam, just a second. And he named that son Bria. Okay, kind of naming after the tragedy that they had. Uvito she'era. This is Our Lady today. and his daughter, i.e. Ephraim's daughter She'erah. Vativen et Bet Horon, and she built Beit Horon Hatachton, Beit Ha'elyon, Vet Uzan She'erah. Okay, and she built 3 cities in Israel: Beit Horon, upper Beit Horon, and lower Beit Horon, and Uzan She'erah. And this is one of the proofs for non-traditional Parshanim, where they say, well, not all the Jewish people left Israel. Some of them lived in Israel, because otherwise, I don't understand how those people were killed in Israel. They lived in Israel, they were killed in Israel, right? They're supposed to be in Egypt, but they are in Israel, they're killed in Israel. And not only that, She'erah builds 3 cities in Israel. So how that's possible if the entire family went down to Egypt? Okay, that is the question. Let me.
Excuse me, Rabbi.
Yes.
Are you projecting this on the screen where people can see it? Because I cannot. I don't have any projection of what you're reading, and I'm wondering if other people do.
Okay. Everybody else, did you see everybody else see that?
Yes.
So I don't know what is going on.
I do not see that.
Can you?
And I don't see the Hebrew.
I understand. Can you try to minimize that screen of the Zoom with everybody's pictures and everything, and maybe you'll be able to see the screen.
Okay, thank you. I didn't mind to interrupt you, but I don't see it at all.
That's
and
okay.
I don't know if I can do it. It's okay. I can hear you, and that's fine.
Okay, so I'm gonna share again. Okay, now here in the pictures, this is Beit Horon, and this is Beit Sirah, which is the modern Uzan She'erah. So those cities are actually 3 Arab villages today in Israel that pretty much are identified as those particular places. Now let's talk about She'erah. Before analyzing that fascinating story, let's try to figure out, what do we know about She'erah? So we know the following. She is Ephraim's youngest daughter. She was born after her brothers died. She was born in Egypt before the Exodus or in the desert, okay? Because we're going to see there's going to be a machloket, there's going to be a debate when that story actually took place. Okay? She'erah, the name She'erah comes from the word she'er. She'er means remainer, right? Like she'erit. Okay, we know from the text that she built 3 cities in Israel, and we know that she's the only woman in the Bible to build and govern 3 cities. In modern Israel today, you have 6 women that are mayor or the head of whatever that particular location, city, whatever. 6, that's all. Only 2%. So, and this is, we're talking about the year 2020. So it's pretty remarkable that she built and governed 3 cities more than 3,000 years ago. Okay? Now, before analyzing the story, what I want to do is I want to understand the structure. So the story, going back to the way the text is presented in the book of Chronicles here, right? So we have, I'm going to go back to here. So we have genealogy, right? These are the descendants, blah, 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 a list of all the names. Then we learn about death, right? Those sons of Ephraim, they die. Then it's he is in mourning. Ephraim is mourning for the loss of his sons. He is consoled, right? And he has there's birth, building, right, of a new son and a new daughter. And then the story goes back into list of those descendants. Again, genealogy. So genealogy, death, mourning, consolation, birth or building, and genealogy. Very important. Have that in mind. Now, when we look at that story, what pops into our mind? And it's also in terms of the text, the choices of words is very, very similar. We have a deja vu to a different guy that was also mourning and refuses to console Jacob. Jacob following the death of, or assumed death of Joseph. Right? Jacob says, Chayara halatu tarof toraf Yosef. He says that, he was captured and eaten by a beast. And then he mourns his son for many days and he refused to console. And of course, the difference is that he refuses to console. Ephraim does console. What's the difference also is that Joseph didn't die. The sons of Ephraim did die. But, and here there's a building, there's future, there's a chapter 2 by Ephraim, but not by Jacob. Now, have that in mind because that becomes part of the memory of the family, right? So when we talk about Ephraim and his tragedy, the fact that his sons were killed, it's part of the family tradition that the grandfather also had a similar story, losing his son, or at least he thought he lost his son. And that becomes quite important. Okay, now we're going to go back to the story itself. What exactly does the text tell us? And that's, by the way, the only place in the Bible, because in Sefer Bereshit, it doesn't talk about that. Okay, so Ephraim has children, Shutelach, Bered, whatever, all that kind of stuff, fine. And then the children of Ephraim end up in Israel, right? And the people of Gat, the Plishtim of Gat, they kill them because some sort of a fight over cattle. They went to get their cattle, or perhaps their cattle was in a different place. It's not clear. And then Ephraim mourns for many days. Eventually, he has another son and another daughter. Now let's understand. Let's go back for a second. The story in Genesis tells us a different story. So first of all, we learned that Yosef had two sons, before the years of famine. Who gave birth to those sons? Osnat, but Potiphera Kohenon. We'd already talked about her. Osnat, his wife, gave birth to two sons, Menashe, and the second one was the second one is called Ephraim. And then the Torah continues later on and tells us, Vayeshev Yosef b'Mitzrayim hu beit aviv. Joseph continues to sit in Mitzrayim, in Egypt, with his family. Vayechi Yosef 110 shanim, and he lives to the age of 110. And not only that, Yosef, Vayar Yosef le'Ephraim b'nei shilashim, he see grandchildren and then also great-grandchildren. Machir ben Menashe Yuldol Birkei Yosef. Okay, so in that age, when you're 110, I guess you get grandchildren or great-grandchildren. Okay, so this is the story in Genesis, which tells us that what? Ephraim, not only that Ephraim was born in Egypt, Ephraim's great grandchildren are still in Egypt. So it brings a problem when we talk about Ephraim's children getting killed in Israel. Right? If we kind of summarize, the story in Genesis says that Ephraim was born in Egypt. He lived to see great grandchildren in Egypt and probably died in Egypt. Right? Because his descendants are going to be slaves later on for 210 years. About what, with regards to the story in Chronicles, the sons of Ephraim are in Israel, right? Uvnei Ephraim hanoladim ba'aretz. And they got killed by the Plishtim in Israel. So we have a seemingly a huge contradiction between the two sources. Okay? Now, how do we reconcile that that problem? So as we said, Ben Gurion and many others assumed that this is the proof, actually, that we have one story in Genesis. That story tells the story of Jacob's family, i.e., part of the family that indeed left Israel, went down to Egypt. However, there's another group. That's the story of Chronicles. A group of the family, part of the family, remains in Israel. This is why I understand they were born in Israel. A couple of generations later, they're born in Israel, and these are the guys that were killed by the Plishtim. Okay, so we have two valid versions of the story of Exodus, two valid. That's according to Ben Gurion and those people. I want to go in a different direction. So first of all, let's be clear about the text itself. The text itself, first of all, says his son, right? If we look at the text in Chronicles, it's and his son and his son and his son and his son. Now, if indeed we're talking about a son and of a son of a son of a son all the time, it makes it to seventh generation, which is kind of difficult. Realistically speaking, it's very difficult to accept that somebody is actually, like Ephraim, is going to have children when he sees a seventh generation. I don't even know how to call it, great children. Okay, it's got to be like very old at that point to have, children, and it doesn't end up. It's like we're talking about 200 years at least to have seven generations. Okay, so some of the commentaries point out that the word bno, his son, is not always, and specifically in the context of Sefer Divrei Hayamim, in the context of Chronicle, it's not always his son. Sometimes we're talking about a brother. Okay, and there are many examples to prove that. So if we're talking about a brother, so it's the same generation, it makes more sense. Okay, but that creates a different problem because now we have brothers with the same name, which makes no sense as well. So what we need to assume is that it's a combination of children and siblings, all that list. Okay, just wanted to put it there, just to be, just to do that. Now, we're gonna see now three kind of like interpretations, how to explain that story. I'm gonna share my screen again. And The first one is by Rabbi Yehuda Hasid. Rabbi Yehuda Hasid says the following. The entire story happens in Egypt. The whole family went down to Egypt. This is in the time before slavery, when things were good for the Jews in Egypt. If you remember, the book of Shmot opens with Vayakom melech hadash al Mitzrayim asher lo yada et Yosef. Right? Later on, there was this wicked king who didn't know anything about Joseph, or blah, 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 and things got messy and difficult for the Jews. But up until that point, the Jews in Egypt had a pretty good life. So he said, this story is happening during that time. And what happened? Look at the top. Shekol zman shayu Yisrael b'Mitzrayim. The entire time that the Jews were there in Egypt, hayu lif'amim olchim le'eretz Yisrael. Sometimes they would go to Eretz Yisrael. Al karka Yaakov Avinu. V'hayu bonim sham krachim. Because what? Yes, Jacob went down to Egypt, but guess what? He couldn't take his properties. He couldn't take his land. And the land is still there. The land that belongs to Jacob. It's still there in Israel. And during that time, before slavery, the Jews went back and forth to Israel to manage their properties. And when they were there, they built cities and they did like all sorts of investments and all sorts of kind of stuff because they had property. They had real estate. That makes sense. So, according to Rabbi Yehuda Hasid, one of his proofs is the word that the version in Chronicles use is yardu. They went down. If those people, right, were in Egypt, then they had to go up to Israel, not to go down. So the fact that they were down, okay, it means that they were there. Why they were there? Because they had real estate. So they went down from Israel to get their cattle that was in Egypt. And they were going back and forth the whole time. Now, that brings the other question. If Ephraim was born in Egypt, as we saw in the book of Genesis, how could he have property in Israel? I understand that Jacob has property in Israel. And I understand that maybe even Judah and Reuven and Shimon and Levi, they all have property in Israel because what? They lived in Israel and they came down to Egypt from Israel. So they left properties over there. But Ephraim, he is the son of Joseph. He was born in Egypt. He never lived in Israel. How that's possible that he had property in Israel? So his answer is the following. He says, Rabbi Yehuda Hasid says, V'ani savur, and I think, Shedavka zera Yosef ayusin. Specifically, the children of Joseph were the ones to go back and forth. V'lahen hayta reshut miparo. You know why? Because they had the okay, they had the approval, the permission from Pharaoh to do so. Ki mechamat kvod Yosef, because of the status of Joseph. Paro noeg b'hem kavod, because Paro gave them, he respected them because of their father. Letaken ulchazek et yerushatan. This is part of their inheritance. This is part of their properties, I guess, promised to them by Jacob. And they had tenants over there. If you remember, going back to the story in Genesis, there's a kind of awkward situation over there when Jacob dies. What happens? When Jacob dies, Joseph needs to ask permission, and it's kind of a little bit uncomfortable that he needs to go back to Israel to bury Jacob. And he said to Pharaoh, listen, my father made me take an oath, etc. So from that, we understand it was not that simple for the Jews to leave Egypt, even when things were good. Rabbi Yehuda Hasid comes and teaches us that specifically the descendants of Joseph were able to do so, go back and forth, because Joseph was in his different status than the other brothers. And therefore, we understand why it's the sons of Ephraim, even though he himself was born in Egypt, are the ones to go back and forth. Okay? And therefore, the mitzvah also of Eretz Israel was never cut, was never ended, because they maintained their property in Israel, they maintained their real estate, their land, and they had tenants. And therefore, that also, he says, that explains, he explains that also explains the fear of Pharaoh. If you remember, the later Pharaoh says he is afraid, "V'nilcham banu ve'ala min haaretz." What does it mean, ve'ala min haaretz? It says ve'ala min haaretz means is going to leave, or those who are, they're going to get together with the others, those who are outside of Egypt. Now we understand there was a group in Israel. And this is why, so Pharaoh was afraid that the Jews in Egypt are going to get together with their cousins, their family in Israel, and that's going to be a massive, and they can attack the Egyptians. Second approach. So according to Rabbi Yehuda, everything is understandable. We understand it means that took place, that story of Ephraim losing his kids took place while things were still good in Egypt, before the slavery, and they were going back and forth because they had property in Israel. Second approach. Second approach is by Radak. Radak says the following: Lefichach ani omer, therefore I say, ki ha'maaseh hazeh, our story, when did it take place? Bamidbar or be'eretz ha'gilad. It took place in the desert, i.e., after the Exodus. V'haya adayin Ephraim chai. And Ephraim was still alive. Okay, that becomes problem, because that means, according to that, Ephraim is like at least 250 years old, but whatever, okay? That's not the only one that we came across with stuff like that, but still. וזה יכול להיות כי מחיר בן מנשה היה מכובשי ארץ הגלעד, and it gives another proof that Machir, the son of Menashe, was one of the people that conquered the Gilad. והנה בני מחיר בן מנשה יולדו על ברכי יוסף. And indeed, Machir, the grandson of Joseph, was still born when Joseph was still alive. So, you know, according to that, they had people who lived over 200 years. Now he says, like, you know what's my proof that took place in the desert and actually Ephraim was still alive? ומה שמוכיח הפירוש הזה, כי תמצא מספר בני אפרים בצאתם ממצרים כשנמנו במדבר סיני בשנה השנית. He said, if you follow the story, the census that Moshe took in the second year of the Exodus, how many, what was the number of people of Shevet, of the tribe of Ephraim? So 40,500. 40,500 people. וכשנמנו בכניסתם לארץ בערבות מואב, however, in the 40th year, okay, in the 40th year, in the second census, just before they enter, after 40 years in the desert, when they're about to enter the land of Israel, how many people of Ephraim? Lamed bet elef v'tafkuf, 32,500. So we're missing 8,000 people. And he said, what are those 8,000? Be'elu chet alafim shechasru b'midbar hem shargu bnei Gad. These are the descendants. These are the 8,000 people that were killed by the Plishtim. And therefore, you have a difference of $8,000 in 8,000 people in the number of Ephraim. Chaya, you had a question here? Chaya?
Yes,
Yeah,
יש לי שאלה.
yeah, in English.
Yeah, could you please remind me, I understand the Jews went down to Egypt because of the famine,
Yeah,
and they had cattle and everything.
yeah.
At what point did they become slaves?
There's a debate. According to the traditional approach is something like about 100 years later, or maybe 80 years later, something like that. We can go through the whole math over there. Okay, now, so according to the Radak, when this is happening, the story of Ephraim losing his kids, it's happening in the desert. The proof is that they were 40,000, now they're 32,000. It's 8,000 people from Ephraim that were killed by the Plishtim. And that also somehow leads us to the third approach, which is the Midrash, that tells us that it took place before getting into Eretz Israel. But before we read that Midrash, we need to do a little bit of background, and that has to do a little bit with Chaya's question. We need to understand the numbers that we're talking about when it comes to the slavery and the Exodus and all that kind of stuff. Okay, so let's go back.
One question.
Yeah.
Can I ask something?
Yeah.
You said about Elef is mainly in Divrei Hayamim a family. Can we understand it as 8 family lost their men? In the Midbar also?
It's 8,000 according to that.
Yeah, but you said that the word Elef, especially
It's 8 families. Yeah, according to Ben Gurion. That's not traditional.
Thank you.
Yes. Okay, so let's go back. If you remember that revelation that Abraham already had, right? It's many, many, many years before the Exodus. Abraham has this revelation. He falls asleep. It's called Brit Ben Abetarim. And in that dream, God tells him the following: you should know that your descendants are going to be foreigners in a different country, strangers in a land not theirs. And they shall enslaved and oppressed them for 400 years. Remember that? Okay, it's a famous pasuk. We discussed that many times. Rashi on that pasuk says the following, because we have a problem with that math. Okay? משנולד יצחק עד שיצאו ישראל ממצרים 400 שנה, כיצד? So first of all, we have a problem. Because what? Before the Rashi, look at the pasuk at the Exodus. The pasuk says, ויהי מקץ 30 שנה ו400 שנה, after 430 years, on that day, the Jews left Egypt. Okay, so something doesn't add up. First of all, Abraham is told that they're going to be slaves for 400 years. The pasuk in Exodus talks about 430 years. Okay, so what's going on over there? And so Rashi, following the rabbis, says the following. So the calculation is slightly different. משנולד יצחק עד שיצאו ישראל ממצרים 400 שנה. כיצד? So he says, first of all, the 30 year, it's 430 years, not from, 430 years from Brit Ben Abetarim. However, it's 400 years from the birth of Yitzchak. So the question is, when the clock starts? So according to Rashi and many, many others, from the moment Yitzchak was born until the Exodus, 400 years. And he explains how. Yitzchak, ben 60 shana כשנולד Yaakov. Yitzchak was 60 when Jacob was born. Yaakov, כשירד למצרים אמר, ימי שני מגוריי 30 ומעט שנה. Right? When Jacob gets to Egypt, he says to Pharaoh that he is 130 years. Okay? So that means 160. ובמצרים היו 210 שנים כמניין רדו. According to the tradition, they were in Egypt for 210 years because it's gematria of Reish Dalet Vav, הרי 400 שנה. So according to that approach, the clock starts when? When Yitzchak was born. It's not Brit Ben Abetarim, because otherwise it's not going to end up. It's going to be 430 years. So according to that, Brit Ben Abetarim took place already 30 years prior to Yitzchak's birth. Okay, fine. There's a lot of different calculations. We're not going to get into that. It could be a lot of fun for a different class, but these are the main approaches. Now, so the Shiabud, the slavery, was 210 years. 400 years is from the birth of Isaac, and 430 years, it means from, I guess, Brit Ben Habetarim, from Abraham's vision. Now, I want to put like another pasuk in context. At the time of the Exodus, a very famous pasuk, beginning of Parashat Veshalach, it says, "Vayi beshalach Paro et ha'am," when Pharaoh let the people go, "Velo nacham Elokim derech eretz Plishtim," God did not lead them by the land of the Philistines, although it was nearer. For God said the people may have a change of heart when they see war and return to Egypt. Right? This is a famous pasuk that God decided to take them in a roundabout. What happened was that things got really messy during that time, and they got stuck in the desert for 40 years. But that's, as we say in Yiddish, a chutza mindset. But the idea was not to take them in the most direct way, short way, but rather do a little detour, because they can't stand, they're not going to be able to deal with a war. Okay, I'm going to pose a question. We're going to answer that question later on. But God didn't prevent them from war. A very short while after that, Amalek attacks them and they get into a war. So what's going on here? If the purpose of that detour was to avoid war because the people can't handle it, which is understandable because there's a group of slaves who just left Egypt, why God allows a war with Amalek? Not only that, they're victorious. Okay, have that in mind. We're going to go back to that in a couple of minutes. Here is the third approach. It appears in the Midrash, fascinating. The Midrash says the following: right? Our pasuk that says that God didn't want to take the Jews in the most direct, shortest route, which means going through the land of Plishtim, because they can't fight, right? And the Midrash tried to understand why. Because God can help. God's going to help them. What's the problem? Fascinating. Ela, but rather, שטעו שבטו של אפרים ויצאו ממצרים עד שלא שלם הקץ. You know what happened? The people of Ephraim miscalculated all those numbers, 400, 430, 210, whatever. They made a mistake. And they left Egypt before the proper time. ונהרגו מהם למד ריבו, and 30,000 of them were killed. How that's possible? שחשבו, their calculation was, מיום שנדבר אברהם בן הבתרים, from the revelation that Abraham had, this is when you count 400 years. Right? God says to Abraham, it's going to be 400 years. So what did they say? They say, well, let's take a calculator and see. Well, it's now 400 years after Brit Ben Abetarim. V'ta'u lamed shana. And they had a mistake of 30 years. What do you mean they had a mistake of 30 years? Okay, according to Bnei Ephraim, it was God promised it's going to be 400 years. So as far as they're concerned, 400 years, it's now, we have to go. ותעו למד שנה שנאמר, בני אפרים נושקי רומי וקשת. Okay, based on a pasuk from Tehillim. לולא שתעו לא יצאו. Had they did not make that mistake, they wouldn't leave Egypt. And because they left 30 years before the proper time, והרגום פלישתים, the Philistines killed them. שנאמר, and here's a quote of our pasuk of בני אפרים, שוטה לך בהרגום אנשי גת. והיו עצמותיהם, here's another piece of information. והיו עצמותיהם שטוחים בדרך חומרים חומרים. And the bones of the deceased were there on the way, not buried. אמר הקדוש ברוך הוא, אם יראן ישראל עצמות בני אפרים שטוחים בדרך, יחזרו למצרים. God said, if the people, the Jewish people, now with the Exodus 30 years later, going to see the bones of their cousins that were killed 30 years before when they left Egypt, when they were killed by the Plishtim, they're going to go back to Egypt. So now we understand something. What is it that the war that God is referring to that they're not going to be able to, they're not going to have the stomach to? And this is why I'm going to take them through the roundabout. It's not the war against an enemy, because indeed, God did not avoid or didn't prevent the war against Amalek. A war in the military sense is something that happened. What is that war? We're talking about the war of the heart. God says they won't be able to stomach that. If I'm going to take them through the land of Plishtim, they're going to see the bones of their cousins that were killed 30 years earlier, and they won't be able to handle it. And they're going to go back to Egypt. Now we understand what's that meaning of the pasuk. It's not war in the military sense, it's emotional war. And indeed, Rashi explains a fascinating phenomenon. If you remember, when the Jews crossed the Red Sea, a short while after the Exodus, they sing a song, the Az Yashir, the song of the Red Sea. Az Yashir Moshe, right? Ashir al Hashem ki ga'oga. Everybody knows that. It's very famous. But what happens? There's a pasuk in that song that says, Shamu amim yirgazun. Okay? The nations heard and they're gonna tremble. Especially what? Chil achaz yoshvei pelashet. Trembling are the people of Pleshet, Plishtim. And we're trying to understand why specifically the Plishtim are going to be trembling. Why the Plishtim are so fearful more than the others, the other nations? What's going on here? And Rashi explains why the Plishtim specifically. Mipnei shehargu et bnei Ephraim, because those Plishtim killed the sons of Ephraim. Shemiharu et haketz veyatzu bechozka, because they left before the due time. Kimtforash b'divrei hayamim v'hargu min shagat, and he gives the proof. The text proof is our pasuk in Divrei Hayamim in Chronicles. Not only that, on that pasuk that the Midrash quotes from Tehillim, Bnei Ephraim noshkei romi v'keshet, What does it say? Because it says, Bnei Ephraim, the sons of Ephraim, Noshkei Romi Vakeshet. You know, Keshet is a bow and arrow. It's like, so the Midrash tried to explain, what is this? What is this kind of like military or weapons that they're dealing with? Why the people of Ephraim are handling weapons? And he says, they had to fight their way. They fought their way out of Egypt before the time. Sorry, I have a little spelling mistake here. And they trusted their own power and their own weapon. However, they were defeated at the end of the day. Okay, just like as our pasuk supported in Chronicles. So, if we summarize that, the people of Ephraim made a mistake in the calculation and the length of the exile, so to say, right? In Brit Ben Abetarim, Abraham was told that the Galut is going to be 400 years. However, the clock starts from the birth of Isaac 30 years later. Bnei Ephraim thought that the clock starts from Brit Ben Abetarim. That means they need to leave Egypt because that's the time, 30 years before. And what happens? 300,000 people are killed by the Plishtim in Gat. Okay? And that explains to us also what is that war that God is talking about, because God did not avoid the war against Amalek or war in the military sense. We're talking about that they could stomach the sight of when the Jews left Egypt, seeing their cousins, the bones of their cousins who left 30 years earlier. Okay. A little take on that has the Rambam. The Rambam says the following. עוד אני אומר כי הפשט מחובר מהכל הוא שנאמר, also I claim the following, שנאמר כי הגזרה הייתה 400 שנה מן היום ההוא. He said, there was no mistake in the calculation. God told Abraham 400 years, and that's what it's supposed to be. It's not supposed to be an additional 30 years. However, what happened? כאשר הזכרנו, וה30 שנה האלו הם תוספת עליהם בעוון הדור ההוא. That was additional 30 years that the Jews got to stay in Egypt because of sins. The people in Egypt, we know, were not great tzaddikim, they were not righteous, right? If you remember the Midrash that says that they had to leave Egypt because they were very close to sink into the 50th level of impurity. Once you sink into the 50th, you're doomed. And they were already in 49. So things were not so great spiritually in Egypt. Without getting into why and whether justified or not, it doesn't matter. So Ramban says the original plan was indeed 400 years. However, they were not worthy to leave after 400 years because things were bad. They didn't have, from a spiritual point also. And therefore, God punished them with additional 30 years. ואפשר שהיה זה סיבת בני אפרים שיצאו 30 שנה קודם. And now we understand, he said, why the people of Ephraim left 30 years earlier, before Moshe came. כמו שהזכירו רבותינו כי הם ענו ולא טעו. There was no mistake in their calculation. 400, they know how to count to 400. They didn't know that God changed the plan. They didn't know that God decided to add 30 years. Okay? And this was the problem. So, from that, it seems that indeed the people of Ephraim, whether they miscalculated or not, or whether it was in the desert, all that kind of stuff really doesn't matter. The point is that it seems that they sinned. There was a right time to leave Egypt. They didn't do it. They didn't wait for the right time. They took things into their own hands, and therefore they were punished. They did not wait for the redemption to come vis-a-vis Moshe Rabbeinu, and they were punished. Which reminds us a modern approach, anti-Zionist approach. And of course, the most vocal is the Satmar, the Neturei Karta. If you look in the slide, the greatest opponent to modern Zionism is a group from the Satmar Hasidim. Not all the Satmar Hasidim are they think that way. There's a group from the Satmar Hasidim that is called Neturei Karta, and they're very militant and very vocal, and they do a lot of stuff, and I'm sure you know about them. But they based their actions and everything based on the Admor of Satmar. He already died a long time ago, but the Admor of Satmar was Harav Yoel Teitelbaum. That's his picture. And he wrote his philosophy and his approach in 3 sections that were compiled together into a book, a very famous book called Vayoel Moshe. And he's dealing there with the oaths, those 3 oaths that God made the Jewish people take. I don't want to go into that, but it's very famous. 3 oaths. It's in-depth analysis of his book is of those 3 oaths and their practical halachic implications. The 3 oaths are originally detailed by the Talmud in the tractate of Ketubot, and the Talmud discusses a passage from Song of Songs in the Bible in which God made the Jewish people promise to wait for him before arousing his love. That translates, do not do certain things, don't take matters into your own hands. So in his book, in Vayoel Moshe, basically he says the following. A, the status of the 3 oaths is still valid. Number 2, therefore, Jewish sovereignty in Israel is a violation of those oaths. Number 3, living in Israel is permitted only in order to perform mitzvot, not to be in a Jewish state, not to have Israeli army, government, etc. It's only for the purpose of fulfilling mitzvot that you cannot do, for example, outside of Israel. And Hebrew as a language, as a holy language, must not be used outside of Torah learning, and therefore they use only Yiddish. They refuse to speak in Hebrew. We can talk about the Neturei Karta and the Satmar Hasidim for a long time. I don't want to go into that. I think everybody understands. Obviously, this is the fringes. Most of the Haredi community is not, vast majority is not like the Satmar Hasidim. And even within the Satmar Hasidim, this is a very small group, very militant group, but very vocal group, but it's a small group. So this is the approach of the anti-Zionists, i.e., you take things into your own hands. You don't wait for the Geulah, for the redemption by God, and therefore that's a sin. You must not do that. And it seems that Bnei Ephraim did the same thing. Whether they were mistaken or not, it doesn't matter. They didn't wait for the Geulah. They didn't wait for the redemption. by God sending Moshe, and therefore it's wrong. So it seems that he has, the Satmar Hasidim have a serious basis for their philosophy. But I think that the following Gemara says exactly the opposite. The Gemara in Sanhedrin is dealing with the following. It says, Rabbi Eliezer, bno shel Rabbi Yosei HaGlili says, Rabbi Eliezer says the following, Metim shehecheya Yechezkel alu le'eretz Yisrael. I'm going to get into that in a second, but what it means, he says that the dead people that Ezekiel revived, okay, Ezekiel revived those dead people okay, let's go actually to the book of Ezekiel and see those psukim for a second. Here, I'm in the second source. Ezekiel 37. I was in a valley. And that valley is full of bones. That's Ezekiel's revelation. He says the following. And I was walking around those bones. Many bones. And they're very dry. That means that those people died a long time ago. And I had a vision. Just like God told me. And the Spirit came to them and they were revived. And they stood up. A very large group of people. And God said to me, this is the entire Jewish people. Okay, let's put it in context. So Ezekiel prophesizes. Where does Ezekiel prophesizes? Okay, Ezekiel prophesies after destruction of the first temple. He is in the exile in Bavel. Okay, and he says, I saw the bones of the Jewish people that were murdered, that were killed during the destruction of the Jewish state. Okay, that destruction led to the destruction of the temple, obviously. And those bones were revived. I don't want to go into that too much, but that's the vision. That's what Ezekiel talks, that Chazon ha'atzamot ha'yeveshot, the vision of the dry bones, very, very famous vision of Ezekiel. Dry bones revived by God. Okay, now let's go back to the Gemara. The Gemara says, Rabbi Eliezer, the son of Rabbi Yosei HaGlili, says that what? That those people, the dead, that Ezekiel brought back to life, you know what happened to them? Because remember, he is in Bavel, he is in Babylonia. Alu le'eretz Yisrael, they made aliyah. V'nasu nashim v'holidu banim v'banot, and they got married and they had children. Amar Rabbi Yehuda ben Beteira al raglav, and Rabbi Yehuda stood and he said, Ani mibnei benehem, I'm a descendant of those people who were revived by Ezekiel. V'halalu tfilin shehiniach li avi abba mehem. And the tefillin that I'm wearing now is I got from my father, who got it from his father, who got it from his father. That was a tefillin that belonged to my ancestor, who was revived by Ezekiel. And and who are those dead people that Ezekiel revived? There's some problems here with the sound. I'm going to try to solve that. Just check, guys, check if you were unmuted for, by chance. Who are those people that were revived, brought back to life by Ezekiel? Amar Rav, Rav says, Elu bnei Ephraim. These are the people of Ephraim. שמנו לקץ וטעו. Those descendants of Ephraim that miscalculated the exile and they made a mistake. Okay, and ובני אפרים שותה לחוברת בנו ותחת בנו, that's the pasuk. והרגו מנשי גת הנולדים בארץ, and those people were killed by the Plishtim. Wow. The Gemara here says what? That the people that those people of Ephraim that were killed by the Plishtim, now we're talking about generations after. We're talking about if that happened either at the time of just before 30 years before the Exodus, or even before the slavery, according to Rabbi Yehuda Hasid, or during the time of in the desert, like the Radak says, it really doesn't matter. The point is that we're talking about many, many, many years later. Now we're talking about after the destruction of the first temple already. We're talking about the exile in Bavel. Those bones were revived by Ezekiel, which teaches us what? Yes, that was a problematic act on Bnei Ephraim. Maybe they were mistaken, maybe they sinned, but at the end of the day, guess what? They were revived after many years. And not only that, they made Aliyah and they built Israel, which is exactly takes us back to this idea of the structure of the story, that what? After the morning, there's birth, there's building. That's what's happened with Ephraim. And therefore, unlike Rav Tattelboim and the Satmar Hasidim, we believe that we do have the right and even the obligation to create Jewish sovereignty in Eretz Israel, use Hebrew, etc. Now, what's interesting is that the person who wrote the Book of Chronicles chose to write this story in this ambiguous way that could be interpreted, just like the way Ben Gurion interpreted, that there was no Exodus. So the question is why the author of the Book of Chronicles kind of camouflages Yetziat Mitzrayim. Yetziat Mitzrayim, the Exodus, is a monumental event in our history. So why he kind of camouflages that? So first of all, who wrote the Book of Exodus? We're talking about Ezra. Ezra Sofer, he's the one who wrote the Book of Chronicles, I'm sorry. When? In the time of Shivat Zion, the times of when the Jews left, at least some of them, left Bavel to go back to Eretz Israel to build the second temple. And here, Ezra is very much aware of the psukim by Yirmiyahu. Yirmiyahu says destruction of the first temple already. Yirmiyahu says, "Lachen hinei yamim ba'im neum Hashem." A time is coming, said the Lord. "V'lo yomru od chai Hashem asher e'ela et bnei Yisrael me'Mitzrayim." When it shall no more be said as the Hashem who brought the Jews out of Egypt, but rather Kim Chai Hashem asher e'ela v'asher hevi et zera beit Yisrael me'eretz tzafona, but rather God who brought out and led the offspring of the house of Israel from the northern land and from all the lands to which I have banished them, and they shall dwell upon their own soil. Yirmiyahu, before the destruction of the first temple, before Ezekiel, says what's going to happen. He said there's going to be a time in which the Exodus is not going to be the most monumental, the most important event. It's going to be small. It's not going to be that important. Because what? The most important event is what? It's kibbutz galuyot. It's the ingathering of people after the exile. In a similar way, from the Haggadah, everybody recognized that story from the Haggadah of Pesach. עד שדרשה בן זומא שנאמר, למען תזכור יום צאתך מארץ מצרים, you shall remember the day of the Exodus, כל ימי חייך, all your life. ימי חייך, הימים, כל ימי חייך, הלילות. Right? ימי חייך is the days, כל ימי חייך is the night. Everybody remembers that from the Haggadah of Pesach. והחכמים אומרים, disagree with בן זומא, and they said, what? ימי חייך העולם הזה, כל ימי חייך להביא לימות המשיח. Right? So Ben Zoma, in his debate with the Chachamim, says that what? In the times of Mashiach, we're not gonna mention Yetziat Mitzrayim anymore, because the Mashiach, the arrival of Mashiach, is going to be so much more powerful and so much more important than the Exodus. We don't even say it. But the rabbis, the Chachamim, say no. Yetziat Mitzrayim is not going to be completely uprooted or not remembered, but rather it's going to be a minority event compared to the exit. It's going to be to the arrival of Mashiach. In a similar way, like for example, like when you say an English date, so you say the year 2020. You don't say the year from creation. You say from another event that took place that is more important theoretically. Okay, same goes for you can say that we're in the 72 years for Tkumat Israel, for the return of the Jewish people to the modern state of Israel, and not Yetziat Mitzrayim. We don't use Yetziat Mitzrayim because there are other events that are more monumental, perhaps, and more important. So without getting that, we're not doing that today, but I'm saying, according to this, that's what Ben Zoma, the Machloket Ben Zoma and the Chachamim say. The event of Mashiach is going to be so much important, so much impactful than Yetziat Mitzrayim. And therefore, we're not going to even mention Yetziat Mitzrayim, just like what Yirmiyahu says. Just exactly what Yirmiyahu says. What the Braita says the following in a more explicit way. Amar lahem Ben Zoma, this is not in the Haggadah, this is the continuation of the discussion. The Bible says, the Ben Zoma said to the Chachamim, V'chi mazkirim Yetziat Mitzrayim b'mot HaMashiach? Are we going to mention Yetziat Mitzrayim in the time of Mashiach? V'alo kvar ne'emar, hine yamim ba'im, v'lo yamru. He said, but it's like, he quoted the psukim from Yirmiyahu. Lo sheteyaker Yetziat Mitzrayim imkoma v'Yetziat Mitzrayim tefela lo. As we said, that means that Yetziat Mitzrayim is going to be a minority event compared to the coming of Mashiach. Now we have to understand something. So our psukim, our story, describe an event that really doesn't matter what it took place. Somehow it relates to the Exodus. However, the Exodus is not mentioned at all, and the question is why. And Divrei Hayamim does not mention that because it seems that everything is happening in Israel because it was written by Ezra Sofer. Ezra Sofer lives in Israel already. He moved from Babel to Israel. That means he's trying to get people, come on, let's make Aliyah. We're going to rebuild Beit HaMikdash. And he says what? It's more important for Ezra to mention Aliyah, Shivat Zion, going back to Israel after the exile of 70 years in Babel. That's more important. Yes, Yetziat Mitzrayim is there, it's in the background, but it's not that important because what's important is returning to Eretz Israel after 70 years in Babel. And therefore, he's not highlighting Yetziat Mitzrayim. Another question that we have, if you look, I'm going to go back to our story. Okay, so Vayavo Uvito She'era, I'm sorry, I should have added here another pasuk, which I didn't. the list of the genealogy ends with Yoshua bin Nun. This is the genealogy of Ephraim, all the names, and it ends with Yoshua bin Nun. And the question is, why? What's the meaning of that? Why this is so important? And in order to understand that, why the genealogy of Ephraim, it ends with Yoshua bin Nun, we have to go back to the times of Yoshua bin Nun, and actually in the beginning. Remember that war against Amalek, right? The war against Amalek, what happens? Moshe tells Yoshua, go fight Amalek. And after that, he says to him, God says to Moshe, make a note of that, and I will destroy Amalek, and make sure that Yoshua hears that. The Yalkut Shimoni on that place says the following: V'sim be'oznei Yoshua. What does it mean? Make sure that Yoshua hears that. Magid shebe'oto hayom nimshach Yoshua. Rabbi Yoshua talks about Yoshua. Yoshua is obviously Yoshua bin Nun. This is Rabbi Yoshua in the Midrash. Not the same person, but it's funny that he talks about Yoshua. It has the same name. Anyway, he says what? What does it mean? It means about Yom Nimshach Yoshua. On that day, Yoshua was appointed as the next leader of the Jewish people. What are you talking about? What are you talking about? That makes no sense. Because only before Moshe dies, right? Moshe asked God to appoint somebody, a successor. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu says to him, yeah, okay. And he says to him, Kach lechat Yoshua bin Nun, take Yoshua bin Nun, v'tzivita otam le'eneihem, and you shall tell him, Leman yishmiu kol adat b'nei Israel. So the nation of people will listen to him. In other words, Yoshua bin Nun is being appointed as the successor of Moshe only towards the end of Moshe's time. Not 40 years before that, according to this Midrash. According to this Midrash, he was already appointed 40 years before. What's going on here? Now, in order to understand that, we have to go back and understand the lineage of Yoshua bin Nun. The lineage of Yoshua bin Nun, as we say all the names over there, that ends with Yoshua. That means it ends with Yoshua. And of course, before that, we learn about the battle with Bnei Ephraim. Yoshua is from the tribe of Ephraim, of course. Between the tribe of Ephraim and the people, the Plishtim. Here's the Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer. The Midrash says here, Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Kol otam hashanim sheyeshvu Yisrael b'Mitzrayim, all that time that the Jews were in Egypt, Yeshvu betach v'sha'anan v'shalev. They had a good life. Ad sheba Nun mibnei banav shel Ephraim. Nun, right? Yoshua bin Nun. Yoshua bin Nun, meaning Joshua is the son of Nun. So his father, Nun, came and said, Nigla li HaKadosh Baruch Hu leotzi etchem mimitzrayim. Remember when we said that the people of Ephraim miscalculated, perhaps, or didn't know the real cheshbon on how to do that, and the whole thing with 400 years and 430 years, and they made a mistake for 30 years earlier? Who is the one that actually made that calculation? Who is the one who was leading that? That was Joshua's father, Nun. Bnei Ephraim begiur libam shelem mizera malchut begiborei koach u'milchama, and the people of Ephraim took their, as we say in Yiddish, pekalach. They took their wives and their children and their stuff, and they left Egypt, right? ורדפו המצרים אחריהם והרגו מהם 200,000 כולם גיבורים, בני אפרים נושקי רום. Okay, ביום קרב. So who was that? Who was that was leading that move of the people of Ephraim? Joshua's father. Joshua's father. Okay. Now, the Midrash tells us that the bones of those people are there, waiting. Now, we understand why is it that Moshe chose Joshua to lead the battle against Amalek. Moshe chose Joshua because Joshua was the son of Nun. That Nun was known as let's call it a Mashiach, a false Messiah. That was a huge tragedy 30 years before. He failed. But Moshe wanted to say that that approach is not completely rejected. When he presents Joshua as successor, this idea of taking matters into your own hand is a right approach. But you got to do it with the collaboration of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, of Hashem. You can't do things on your own. But on the other hand, you can't be complacent and wait for a complete redemption only by God, the way the Netur Karta think. You got to do something, but you got to do it the right way. It's not the Nun's way. He wanted to do it on his own. It's not the Netur Karta way, where you just sit and wait for everything to be done for you. It's a combination. And that's what Moshe is trying to say. And this is when what the Midrash said, that Joshua was appointed that day. It's not that really indeed he was appointed, but it's a message. Yes, we need that power, what Joshua is representing, what he inherited from his father. Action, taking things into your own hand and do something about it. It's needed, but it's also, you need the prayers. You also need the power of Moses. Moses represents the prayer. Joshua represents action, and you need both of them. When one of them is not there, then it's going to be a failure. And that's what Rabbi Yehoshua ben Chalafta says. This is what he's trying to say, to teach us that Joshua was appointed that day. You know why he was appointed? It was a message that you need to combine both powers, action and prayer. So let's just kind of a little bit summarize the third approach, which is the most fascinating to me. So the elders of Ephraim, they take out their calculators and they start calculate what's going on, right? Nun is the elder. He is the elders of Ephraim. And what happens? And they see, okay, Brit Ben Abetarim, the vision that Abraham had, Abraham was 70, right? And then you add another 5 years in Haran, you add 30 years when Yitzchak was born, 60 more years until Jacob, 130 years of Jacob until he went to Egypt, 210 years of slavery. Altogether, it's 400. That means they believed Nun, that the time of redemption has arrived, and therefore they need to go. What about everybody else? They said, no, you're wrong. Time has not arrived. People of Ephraim don't have a proof, but they said, no, it's time to go. We need to go. Everybody, come on, let's pack yourself and let's go. And they said, no. People of Ephraim said to them, I'm just making this up. People of Ephraim said that, like, you really think it's going to be a proof coming from heaven? Do you think that, like, God himself is going to come and tell you? No, you need to take things into your own matter. You need to. But the people, the other tribes, they said no, and they couldn't think about it. They were slaves, and they didn't. So the people of Ephraim, they didn't wait. They were not afraid, and they got together and they prepared, and they were able even to avoid the Egyptians, or according to the other opinions, they fought the Egyptians, but they were victorious. So that's fine. And they thought God is on our side. We can do it. We have the right answer. And guess what? With that approach, they go into Eretz Israel, and of course, through the shortest route into Eretz Israel, through the Plishtim, they think that they're going to be victorious here. That's not happened. Plishtim are killing them. And the bones are there. And they stay there for years and years and years. And that part becomes part of the story, of the narrative of the Jewish people. And this is why they're so afraid to leave Egypt. Moshe is called later on, and he needs to do all those wonders, and he needs to do all those magic and all those tricks because the people didn't believe him. Vehen lo ya'aminu li. He says, they're not going to believe me. You know why they're not going to believe him? Because in the narrative, there's a failure that took place already 30 years before. And guess what? Eventually they leave. The Jewish people leave in the Exodus. And what happens? Then they have all those miracles, and they cross the sea and all that kind of stuff. And then the Plishtim are afraid of what's going to happen, because the Jews are going to avenge the blood of their brothers. And they were right. And here's the Midrash. The Midrash says here in the bottom, God dipped his weapon, so to say, in the blood of the people of Ephraim, שנאמר, מדוע אדום ללבושך? אמר הקדוש ברוך הוא, איני מתנחם עד שאנקום נקמתם של בני אפרים, שנאמר, ולא נחם אלוהים. God says, I'm not going to console until I'm going to avenge the blood of Bnei Ephraim. And indeed, what happens? 70 years after the killing of Bnei Ephraim, that death is avenged and continues through the history until the time of David and Saul. David and Saul are killing thousands of Plishtim. We have long memory. And then 1,000 years later, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is going to put Ezekiel in that valley with the dry bones of Ephraim. And God asked him, those bones are going to be revived. It means that even after all those years, even it was proven that perhaps they made a crucial mistake, the people of Ephraim, maybe there was benefit. That's the question. Maybe there's still benefit in spite of all this tragedy. And the answer that God says that yes. Bnei Ephraim are the ones are going to be revived. Bnei Ephraim are the ones that are going to show the way back to Eretz Israel, back to rebuild. And what happens? And by the way, in the times of the Hashmonaim, we're approaching Hanukkah. It's the same story. The Hashmonaim fighting the Greeks with no miracles. Nobody knew what's going to happen. They were almost defeated, and eventually they had great miracles, and they were able to establish Jewish sovereignty for 200 years till the destruction of the Second Temple. And we celebrate that holiday every year, even today. And guess what? Later on, after the destruction is going to be another attempt for Geulah, for redemption through militarism. It's Bar Kochba. Bar Kochba was afraid of this tendency that the Jews, just like the Satmar Hasidim, to rely only on Chasdei Shamayim, on God. And therefore, by the way, he had he coined that idea, Lo tis'od ve'lo tichsof, meaning don't help and don't disturb. That's what Bar Kochba says, so to say, right? And guess what? It's going to be later on, it's going to be again in 1948. The spiritual descendants of Bnei Ephraim are going to try to conquer again in the third time. And a lot of people, both religious and non-religious, are going to tell Ben-Gurion, what are you, crazy? You can't do that. You're surrounded by the Arab countries. You can't do that. It's going to be like Bar Kokhba. They're going to kill you. But he decided to follow the path of Bnei Ephraim throughout the generations. They take risk. They rely on their power, and this is why the Jewish state, right? He says, and the establishment of the Jewish people. The way, and by the way Ben-Gurion said it, something very similar to Bar Kokhba and the others. He said, Lakachnu et goraleinu beyadeinu. We took our own destiny in our own hands. That's the message. This is why Joshua was appointed. This is the story of She'erah, daughter of Ephraim. This is the story of our nation. We can't rely on God only, and we have to take things into our own hands. But there's one message that we have to learn from that story, is that we have to do that with at least cooperation and the guidance and the tefillot of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Without that, we're not going to be successful. But we can't also sit and do nothing. That's the story, and that's the end of that.
So She'erah is only mentioned in Divrei Hayamim?
Yes.
Can I say something?
Yes.
If we rely on all the miracles which happened in all the things that you just